Okay, well, I thought I'd start off with a little bit of an interesting fact on John of the Cross, if not, probably can't call it a fun fact. But John sketched this picture of Jesus, and it's been critically reviewed by a lot of professional artists, professional art historians. And a guy who was a former conservator-in-chief at the Louvre in Paris said, when you look at this and you see what was happening in religious art at the time, he said, this picture is almost impossible to imagine. Most of the what was going on in religious art at the time, if you look at crucifixion, has people like you and me looking up at Jesus on the cross. John is incredibly daring, and I think it says something about his relationship with God. He dares to paint Jesus from the perspective of the Father looking down on the crucifixion. And it says something profound about his relationship, I think, with the Trinity. Anyway, so John was a 16th century Carmelite priest and a systematic theologian. He wrote spiritual poetry and later wrote very long commentaries on his poetry. That's his poetry. 80% of that is his poetry plus his long commentaries. His gift to the church and to us is an extraordinarily detailed landscape of the spiritual journey every serious Christian must make if she or he truly wants to be transformed into a glorious image of God. And today, I only want to look at a few short verses of a poem called The Dark Night. And I've got 3 reasons for doing that. First, to provide some important knowledge of what the spiritual journey to God looks like in this life. And knowing that can sometimes be a help to guide the responses you and I should make in our relationship with God. Second, there are phases in the dark night which involve suffering. Now, suffering's a fact of life, and John's teaching provides real hope because it gives an authentically Catholic way to respond. I know that there are people in our community who suffer, and John of the Cross wants particularly to speak to you. Third, John's writings make most sense when a Christian has the experience to which his teaching applies. He's essentially giving us a map to climb a spiritual mountain, and he's telling us what that experience of climbing that mountain is like. Now, today, you might not be able to connect all the markings on the map with your experience, and that's fine. That's perfectly okay. At the end of this talk, tuck the map away and keep it handy, because neither you nor I know the day or the hour when the Holy Spirit is going to silently take our hand and take us into the next phase of the mountain climb. And then we will desperately need to hear what John of the Cross has to say. Nick, maybe could you just dim the lights overhead? That'll make it easier. So I'm just going to quickly explain this diagram. The dark night is essentially divided into 2 parts: the night of the sense and the night of the spirit. The active part, that's what we do. The passive part is what God does. That's the more exciting part, really. I mean, it's pretty boring of stuff that we do. This diagram shows a bit of an order: the active night of the sense leading to the passive night of the senses, leading to the night of the spirit. There is an order here, but our action and God's action often go hand in hand. That's why you've got the double-headed arrow on the left-hand side with the night of the senses. Real life is much messier than this nice, neat diagram shows. John of the Cross was a systematic theologian. He had a neat and tidy mind. I like neat and tidy minds, I have to say. Not everyone experiences the passive night of the senses in the same way, and the length of time can vary considerably. John says that for very weak souls, they are never wholly in the night or wholly out of the night. God refreshes them with spiritual consolations, so they're not tempted to abandon him. Quite appropriately, the night climb starts at sunset. And this is the active night of the senses, where we do actions of self-denial to help bring our sin-inclined flesh under the control of our human spirit. We just come through Lent, and our Lenten practices are the best known kind of example of that. I remember there was a gathering, I think, a couple of weeks ago where two people sort of shared that they were praying in a way that they don't usually pray, and it was a little bit uncomfortable, and they were sort of pushing themselves. It's a good example. So in the externals of our life, there's an ongoing action to get rid of excessive attachments to earthly things. We build relationships in Christ, and we reorder priorities to make times for acts of charity and service to God and others. Internally, we commit some time to spending time in prayer each day and other spiritual practices, perhaps, that we don't necessarily feel like. Father Ken Barker wrote a book called Becoming Fire. If you read chapter 5 of that book, he doesn't use the phrase active night of the senses, but that chapter is all about what we do to get ourselves kind of on the journey. If you move a little bit from the sunset over to the little bit onto the second mountain peak there, that's the twilight or the night of the senses. And I'm going to focus most of my talk on the passive aspect of the dark night of the senses. For the moment, it'll just be enough to say that this is a time when there is still some light, but our ability to see the things of God has begun to fade. Midnight on the climb is represented by that tallest mountain peak. I'm not going to sort of spend a lot of time on this aspect. The moon that you see up there is supposed to be a new moon. If you've ever seen a new moon, there's a thin sliver of light on the edge of the new moon. And that's kind of my sort of attempt to try and represent a pretty complex reality that in the dark night there is light, but it's coming to you from beyond your senses. One of the reasons I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the night of the Spirit is John says, and I quote, "It's horrible and frightful to the human spirit," unquote. So Jesus on the cross is the supreme representation of the passive night of the Spirit. It's not at all about what he does in an active sense, but it is all about what happens to him, what he passively endured, what others did to him. That night experience is best perhaps expressed in his cry from the cross, my God, why have you abandoned me?" When John on the cross talks about this night of the Spirit experience, he clearly draws from his own experience of this night. And in that night, he was aware of a feeling at the core of his human spirit. John saw himself as, and I quote him, "worthy of being loathed and rejected by God, quite rightly and forever," unquote. In the dark night of the Spirit, John was profoundly in touch with the beauty, majesty and grandeur of God, and he was profoundly in touch with the reality that he was so unlike God. And it's this experience, it's the experience of this reality that evoked those words from him that I just read. I'm not going to talk really any more about this, But I'm conscious that there are probably some people here who perhaps have a bit of a hankering to understand and learn a bit more about the dark night of the Spirit. My suggestion is if you want to read a contemporary example of the dark night of the Spirit, this book, The Miracle of Hope. It's the biography of Cardinal Francis Xavier Nguyen Van Wan. He was auxiliary bishop of Saigon when it fell to the communists in 1975. He spent 9 years in solitary confinement. At the end of that time, he was the most dangerous man in Vietnam. His guards got converted by him, and what happened was they thought, well, okay, we're going to change the guards more frequently. Shock, horror. More conversions, more frequently. They felt they couldn't kill him, so they expelled him from Vietnam. If you want to read about the fruit of his prayer, after you've read his biography, this is a good order to do it, you can read this book, Testimony of Hope. In the year 2000, John Paul II invited him to preach the Lenten retreat to the Roman Curia, and the Pope said to him, give them your own testimony. So that's the fruit of his prayer. On the right-hand side, we've got dawn, and this point marks the emergence of the new self, which has been transformed into the likeness of God. This is the new self that's spoken of in Ephesians 4:24. You remember Ephesians? We did that last year. It's a transformation of the self in thoughts, emotions and actions into God's likeness. The more like God we become, the more we are united to him. Okay, next slide, thanks. I'm not going to spend much time on this either, but it's important that I sort of say something just to raise people's awareness. There are elements of spiritual desolation and the dark night that can feel and look very much the same. So in spiritual desolation, some of the feelings that we have, a sense of separation from God, sense of abandonment from God. There's often, as it says up there, a sluggishness in prayer and wanting to serve others. You know, we're not inclined to prayer, we're not inclined to serve others. In fact, almost the opposite is happening in the dark night. It's the other thing I should say in spiritual desolation is obviously sin and spiritual negligence are a primary cause. When I say spiritual negligence, you know, when we're in spiritual desolation, we tend to cut back either the frequency of our prayer or the amount of time that we spend in prayer, and often we're inclined to do both, and abandon whatever other spiritual practices that we have. Something rather different is happening in the dark night. Sin and spiritual negligence is not a primary cause. Hear me clearly on this. I'm not saying the person in the dark night doesn't sin, but what they're experiencing spiritually is not a result primarily of their sin and any spiritual negligence. They're painfully concerned about how to keep serving God and others. There's a lot more to that distinction and difference than those few dot points indicate. I'm just going to leave it there. I could talk for probably an hour on that alone, but we'll move on. Yeah, thank you. So when John speaks of the dark night, he has in mind suffering that is bewildering or incomprehensible. It's suffering which evokes in the strongest terms, why? Why now? Why me? Why is this happening? Whatever kind of why question you want to frame. It's suffering which takes away both the illusion of control over our lives and actual control. And to understand this aspect of the night, let's get in touch with John's own experience. So John lived in the latter half of the 1500s. The Council of Trent had been called to respond to the Protestant Reformation. The council closed in 1563 and John was ordained a couple of years later. He collaborated with St Teresa of Avila in reforming the Carmelite order, and Teresa wanted to take it back to its original ideals. In many ways, they'd drifted away from that. John was a fully paid up member of the Teresa of Avila fan club. He was on board with the reform agenda. I'm not going to go into the detail of the internal politics of the Carmelite reform, but it's enough to say that John found himself, at least temporarily, on the losing side. At age 35, he was abducted from the Spanish town of Avila by his loving Carmelite brothers, and who opposed both him and the reforms of Teresa. And he was taken to Toledo in Spain and there spent 9 months in solitary confinement in a tiny room which functioned as a visitor's toilet. If you've ever been into the confessional over there at St Benedict's Church, he was confined in a space that was slightly bigger than that. These are the old city walls of Toledo, and John was imprisoned somewhere round about here. I haven't got the exact location, but that's the River Tagus, and he could hear that river from the room in which he was locked. And the room had a tiny slit in it in which sunlight shone for about an hour a day. Toledo's freezing cold in winter and stiflingly hot in summer. He was given little food and suffered from malnutrition, and the only time he was permitted to leave was to be flogged regularly, and he had those physical wounds on him for years. He was not permitted to change or wash his clothes, and they became infested with lice. Not content with this, his guards engaged in psychological warfare. So they had loud conversations outside the room in which he was locked up, suggesting that all his religious work was basically useless and fallen apart. He'd wasted his time and all his efforts had been for nothing. Finally, they hinted that he would only leave that room in a coffin. And so he was fearful about whether or not the little food that he was given might have been poisoned. Remember, this has been done to him by his brother priests. Finally, this is suffering that is bewildering and incomprehensible, especially to our tender 21st century Catholic charismatic ears. Now, not every form of suffering is automatically the dark night, but any suffering can become the dark night of faith for a Christian. That's a pretty strong claim, and I'm going to draw in now John Paul II here to show us something pretty important. As Pope, he wrote a letter to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the death of John of the Cross. And in it he said this: physical, moral and spiritual suffering, like sickness, war, injustice, lack of meaning in life, sorrowful knowledge of sin, the seeming absence of God, are for the believer all purifying experiences which might be called a night of faith. Now, the Pope's list is a list of examples. It's not exhaustive, and I've decided I'm going to add a few more examples to his list. So, ageing and dying, very serious illness, sexual abuse, a chronic or sudden major disability, sudden death of a family member, betrayal or abuse by a spouse or close friend, loneliness, serious financial difficulties, restrictions when you've just come to enjoy a new freedom, and circumstances where you are forced to be with people who mock or sideline your faith. Any form of suffering has the potential to become a dark night of faith. But for any suffering to be the dark night, there must also be an inflow of God. In the passive night of the senses, there's a change in prayer. The Christian gets no satisfaction from God in prayer or from God's creation. Prayer usually feels bone dry. But in the passive night, the Christian person usually turns to God painfully concerned about how to keep loving and serving God. But the person's will to love and to serve also feels weak and bone dry. The Christian is unable to talk to God through meditation or make use of their imagination in prayer. This is because the Holy Spirit is preparing the person to receive God in a simple act of contemplation. When John talks about contemplation, he means a peaceful and loving inflow of God which is communicated directly to the human spirit and not through the senses. And this inflow does a couple of things. It fires up divine love in the Christian soul, but the person is often unaware at the early stages of the fire beginning to grow in their soul. It unhooks us from the sensory ways in which we usually measure God's presence and activity. And we typically do this through our sense of feeling. You know, we get out our sort of spiritual compass. Click, click, God feels close. I'm sure that's the case. Click, click, he feels like he's far away. That must be the case. You know, so he's unhooking us from the ways in which we normally measure his presence and activity. And it gives the person great freedom from the controlling influences of the world, the sinful inclinations of the flesh, and the devil. In that second diagram I showed you, which gave you a little bit of an overview of the dark night, that second slide, John of the Cross said there that the passive night of the senses is experienced by many. But does he really mean people like you and me? Does he really mean people like you and me? Well, I'm convinced personally that he does. And I've got agreement to share with you today some testimony from someone who describes themselves as an ordinary member of our DOJ community. The testimony is being shared on the basis of anonymity, and there are certain limits as to what I can say. This testimony focuses on the person's prayer experience up to the point that there's an inflow of God. The experience began early in the COVID pandemic. Many changes were imposed on the practical realities of their life at that time, and that created severe distress. Previous ways of praying, especially with scripture, began to feel dry. There was a diminishing sense of God's presence, no spiritual consolations, and a general feeling of being unable to pray. Whilst this was going on, the person continued to turn up for prayer, desired to pray, and stayed for the amount of time they'd allocated. Prayer did not feel like prayer. When asked what happens in your prayer, the person said their prayer was mostly, quote, a long continuous complaining to God, unquote. That experience continued and deepened over time. After more than 2 years of this, the person's prayer reached a turning point, and I'm now reading from their testimony. Quote, "I was no longer sure that what I was doing in my prayer time could be called prayer. Through spiritual reading, I was led to Luke 8:43 to 47. That's the woman with the hemorrhage. At first, I dismissed the story as being of no help. I was not physically ill. For some reason, I read the text again. I then realised that my spirit was bleeding, and it was bleeding unto death. I did not get angry with God or others. I did not demand to be healed. I simply accepted that my spirit was dying. I asked, how does a dying person pray? I had barely finished asking the question when an answer was given to me. Into your hands I commit my spirit. I said this prayer once each day and waited for the last drop of my spirit to bleed out." Unquote. After a few weeks, the person tried 3 times to picture themselves in the gospel scene of the woman with the hemorrhage. They could not even imagine stretching out their hand. Soon after this, the person went to a funeral mass, and it's there that they received an inflow of God. I'm now reading from the testimony. Quote, "Shortly after I received Holy Communion, this happened. It seemed like I was lying on a road, and it felt like there was an enormous crush of people all around me. It was pitch dark. I saw and heard no one. Suddenly, the hem of Jesus' garment brushed my face. I felt this physically. It was as strong as if you and I had very gently bumped elbows in the corridor. I knew it was Jesus because immediately his garment touched my face. I felt power flow into me and the bleeding in my spirit stopped instantly." Unquote. For the dark night to be an experience of sheer grace, there has to be an acceptance, a yes, a surrender. The dark night rests on the reality of a God who is involved with you and me, a God who is both with us and for us. For John of the Cross, the universe is drenched in the life-giving, ever-flowing ocean of God's love. It's pressing all around, always ready, waiting, wanting, willing to flow into us. Night makes us afraid, very afraid, and we're inclined to run from it. John encourages us to persevere in faith because the darkness is making space for the inflow of God. The darkness is his way of clearing what blocks his inflow, and the hardest thing that we might have to do spiritually is stay put and don't give in to tempting distractions. I want to make this point that John does not glorify suffering for the sake of suffering, right? He didn't see a person who looked sad and depressed and sidle up to them and say, "You're suffering? You need a few more bucketfuls of that." If he saw a suffering person, he'd go over and he'd spend a lot of time trying to cheer them up. But he does see suffering as a privileged channel to relate to God, and that's because God's love was shown most fully when Jesus suffered on the cross. John also doesn't want us to suffer unnecessarily. In the midst of the dark night, finding some inner peace may need one or more decisions to help us avoid suffering unnecessarily. So while remaining faithful to God, it might also be necessary to make some changes to the external realities of your life. In John's own case, he engineered his escape from prison, tiptoeing between sleeping Carmelite friars between 2 and 3 in the morning after he'd kind of loosened some screws on the door handle. And he needed to do that, otherwise he would have died then and there. The dark night is an invitation to shift decisively from our own resources to God's. It's an invitation to trust God. When John was in prison, he composed several poems. The Dark Night is one such poem. That poetry is a sign of God releasing in him something creative and which was previously unavailable to him. And that God-initiated creativity came through faithfulness to Jesus in the midst of John's own suffering. In the passive night of the senses, the dominant feeling is an inability to pray. John's advice is to be content with a simple, loving focus on God and without the desire to taste or feel him. It will not be the time for vocal prayer or meditation, and it will feel like we are doing nothing and wasting time in prayer, but it frees our souls to receive what God is communicating beyond our senses. What's on offer in the dark night is a transformed friendship with God beyond what we could possibly ask for or imagine. Night is a place of terror, and it is also pregnant with the possibility of new birth. And God will bring forth new life. God will bring forth new life if we have the courage not to deny in the darkness what we have seen in the light.